Hi, welcome to our channel of ignou audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Social Sciences, SOSS, Master's Degree Programs, MA in Psychology, MAPC, Second Year, MPCE 0 to 3 Interventions in Counseling, Block 2 Cognitive Behavioral Counseling, Unit 1 Introduction to Behavior, Modification and Cognitive Approach in Counseling, 1.0 Introduction. Learning is an integral part of life. We learn and unlearn many things from our day-to-day experience. Since we learn things, we can also unlearn those things. The behavioral counseling approach is based on this assumption of learning and unlearning different aspects of behavior. We tend to acquire and continue those behaviors that are approved, reinforced and rewarded, whereas behavior that is not approved or considered undesirable tend to disappear. Thus, the behavioral approach makes use of principles of reward, reinforcement and punishment to bring about desired changes in behavior. However, this approach was mechanical in nature, which assumed that human behavior is governed by external stimuli only. Human being is not so mechanical as to be regulated by the SR, stimulus-response, mechanism. What about the thoughts, perception, feelings and beliefs of the human being? Hence, it is not only the mechanical acquisition of physical responses, but the perception of the situation by the child also gets associated with physical responses. This led to the emergence of cognitive behavioral approach, Ellis, 1962, Beck, 1976, Machenbaum, 1977. According to this approach, thoughts, ideas, beliefs form an important part of behavior which is learned. The behavioral view ignored the subjective experiences of the individual. The individual was seen as passive, human beings having no free will of their own. However, the cognitive behavioral approach considered thoughts, ideas, beliefs as important part of human behavior. Thus, in this unit, we are going to learn about the meaning of behavior approach as well as cognitive approach to counseling. The procedure for each approach will be described and the different techniques under behavioral modification and cognitive approach will also be discussed. Finally, the potentials and limitations of both behavioral and cognitive approaches to counseling will be delineated. 1.1 Objectives. After completing this unit, you will be able to define behavior modification and cognitive approach in counseling, explain the principles of behavior modification, describe the procedure of behavior modification and cognitive therapy, explain the different techniques of behavior modification and cognitive therapy, and analyze the potentials and limitations of both behavior and cognitive therapy. 1.2 Introduction to Behavior Modification. Behavior modification or behavioral counseling is a form of psychotherapy that is based on the learning theories of classical conditioning and operant conditioning. It applies these learning principles to bring about positive changes in behavior and reduce or eliminate undesirable behavior. Behavior modification employs empirically tested behavior change techniques to improve behavior and or reduce maladaptive undesirable behavior. It refers mainly to techniques for increasing adaptive behavior through reinforcement and decreasing maladaptive behavior through extinction or punishment. The first use of the term behavior modification appears to have been used by Thorndike in the year 1911. He talked about the law of effect where responses followed by satisfying state of affairs were strengthened whereas responses followed by dissatisfying state of affairs were decreased or discontinued. The learning theories of classical conditioning by Pavlov and operant conditioning by Skinner have further contributed to the development of behavior modification approach to counseling. Classical conditioning proposes that our behavior responses are conditioned, i.e., there is an association between the stimulus which elicits the response and our response. When this association becomes strengthened on the basis of reward, conditioning happens and the behavior is learned. This is the basic conditioning process. Operant conditioning is based on the law of effect. This conditioning consists of behavior that is followed by consequences that are satisfying to the organism, and so will be repeated. Behavior that is followed by unpleasant consequences will be discouraged. For example, when a child throws temper tantrum, parents give in to his demand. As a result, the child learns that if he throws tantrums, his needs will be satisfied. Here parents' attention and giving in to his demand is the reinforcer for the child, and thus the child will repeat the same behavior in the future. 1.2.1 Definition of behavior. First, let us see what do we mean by behavior. Behavior is such a term which we use commonly, and yet we may not be aware of its exact meaning. We talk about behavior using the terms such as hardworking, kind, sociable, ungrateful, independent, selfish, etc. However, if we analyze, these terms do not refer to the specific things we note in a person when, for instance, we say hardworking or selfish. In general, we may understand what selfish behavior means or nervous behavior means, but we may not know the person's nervousness refers to his nail-biting or fidgeting or pacing in the room. It is very essential that we talk about behavior very specifically. Essentially, behavior is anything that a person says or does. Behavior modifiers generally talk very precisely about the behavior. This helps in focusing on the particular aspect of behavior which need to be changed. Behavior also need to be described either as behavioral deficits or behavioral excesses. Behavioral deficit refers to something lacking. Example, the child is not able to mix and interact with his classmates. The child has not learned how to eat in a proper manner in a restaurant. The teacher is not able to manage her anger if some child disturbs her class. The manager does not know how to conduct himself in a board meeting. Behavioral excesses refer to behavior which is out of control. For example, a child showing tantrums, an adult engaged in continuous smoking or drinking, a child eating candies and toffees frequently, or seeing television continuously. Thus there is a deviation of behavior, either lack or excess of behavior, which causes the problem and need to be addressed. Behavior modification helps in changing these problem behaviors and establishing the appropriate behavior. However, one thing to be noted here is that identification of behavioral lack or behavioral excess should always consider the context, the culture, and the ethics of the persons involved. Although some behavior like self-injurious behavior is always inappropriate no matter what the context is. 1.2.2 Meaning of behavior modification. Thus, behavior modification can be described as an approach to psychotherapy, which is based on learning theory and aims to address the client's problems through techniques designed to reinforce desired and eliminate undesired behaviors. The behavior modification approach involves the development and encouragement of desirable behaviors and removal and reduction of undesirable behaviors by methods based on the learning and reinforcement principles. In simple terms, behavior modification assumes that behaviors can be acquired, learned, and can also be unlearned. Hence, if the child has learned any negative behavior, it can also be unlearned and new desirable behavior can be learned. Thus, the relationship between observable stimuli and response is important, and reward and punishment can be used to control and regulate this relationship between stimulus and response. Thus, according to Skinner, greater or lesser reinforcement can be used to modify behavior. For example, Rajan, A 5-year-old boy always pushes other children in front of him and has not learned to stand in a line and wait for his turn. Behavior modification in this case will help the child to change his behavior by the use of reward and learn to be disciplined while standing in a line. 1.2.3 Principles of Behavior Modification. Behavior modification principles and practices are used to assist individuals with developing new, desirable behaviors while eliminating behaviors that are no longer useful. Reinforcement and punishment are the main principles of behavior modification. Reinforcement strengthens a behavior, while punishment weakens a behavior. Both can be either positive or negative. Positive reinforcement describes desirable behavior rewarded with a pleasant stimulus, while negative reinforcement describes desirable behavior rewarded with the removal of a negative stimulus. Positive punishment occurs when an undesirable behavior results in the addition of a negative stimulus, while negative punishment occurs when an undesirable behavior results in the removal of a pleasant stimulus. For example, a rat accustomed to receiving food when pressing the lever no longer receives food when pressing the lever. The rat has experienced negative punishment. However, positive punishment is not much used because when misused, more aversive punishment can lead to affective emotional disorders. The difference between positive and negative reinforcement is that in positive reinforcement, a response behavior produces a stimulus, positive reinforcer, whereas in negative reinforcement a response removes the occurrence of a negative stimulus. Examples of positive reinforcers are food, money, recognition, whereas negative reinforcement leads to the learning of avoidance and escape responses. For instance, when we ignore the child when he throws a tantrum, it is a negative reinforcement.
There's positive reinforcement as well as negative reinforcement. Both tend to increase or strengthen behavior. However, negative punishment decrease or weaken the undesirable behavior. When the child misbehaves and given time out, removal of the pleasant stimulus, for example, being with friends, it leads to decrease the undesirable behavior of the child. The principles of operant conditioning which are used for the behavior modification also applies a schedule of reinforcement to bring about the desired results. Target behaviors are reinforced as soon as they occur, while negative behaviors are discouraged. Reward and punishment tools are also used to strengthen new behaviors. In effect, these tools work to redirect a person's motivations toward the desired outcome. Further, a behavior, or habit, is framed by what happens before and what happens after the behavior is carried out. The principle of extinction is also made use of, which works by removing or changing what happens after the behavior takes place. In effect, the incentive or reward that motivates a person to carry out a certain behavior is taken away. When this happens over and over again, the motivation to indulge in a certain behavior begins to fade. Eventually, the behavior itself becomes extinct for lack of incentive. 1.2.4 Steps, Procedure of Behavior Modification. The goal of behavior modification is always to bring about a change in the behavior. The change may be in terms of filled circle, a newly developed behavior, filled circle, increase or strengthening of a behavior, filled circle, maintaining a behavior at a particular rate or pattern of occurrence, filled circle, decrease or change in a behavior. Deciding the goal is only one part of the entire procedure for behavior modification. First of all, we need to analyze the problem behavior through a process of behavioral assessment. Behavioral assessment helps us to understand the problem in its different aspects, in different contexts and across different settings, situations. The problem is studied in detail: frequency, how often the behavior occurs, e.g., how many times the child has used abusive language in a class, duration, how long the problem behavior lasts, e.g., the child goes on talking abusive language or uses it for a while only, intensity, how severe is the behavior, e.g., the child uses extreme abusive language or mild abusive language. Thus, baseline data forms an important step in the behavior modification plan. Specific information about the behavior is collected. The ABC model of behavioral analysis, also called functional analysis, is used. The ABC model refers to filled circle A, antecedent. It describes what happens just before the occurrence of the behavior, filled circle B, behavior. It describes the client's behavior, filled circle C, consequence. It describes the consequence, i.e., what happens after the behavior. Antecedents help in understanding the problem in detail, what precipitates the problem, when it occurs, at what setting it occurs, who are present, what type of event, situation usually leads to the behavior, problem in question. Behavior refers to the behavior shown or demonstrated. Consequences determine the client's behavior. Consequences refer to what does the behavior lead to, how do parents, teachers, peers respond to the child's behavior. This determines whether the behavior will continue or be modified or decrease or increase. In other words, the ABC model can be described as follows: what comes directly before the behavior, what does the behavior look like, and what comes directly after the behavior, respectively. Once enough observations are made, the data are analyzed and patterns are identified. If there are consistent antecedents and/or consequences, an intervention should target those to increase or decrease the target behavior. If the behavior pattern shows a particular antecedent or trigger, then intervention can be to avoid that trigger as far as possible and to learn a new behavior in the presence of the trigger. If a problem behavior occurs because it achieves some purpose, then there is a requirement to teach an alternative behavior which will achieve the same purpose without creating any problem. The functional assessment helps in understanding the behavior. This facilitates in planning the appropriate intervention technique. The following steps can be delineated in the behavioral assessment process. The problem behavior is described in detail with example of its occurrence. Fill circle. All the antecedent factors are also elaborated. Fill circle. The consequences are noted down. Fill circle. The goals are specified. Fill circle. Accordingly, the target response is stated in precise terms. Fill circle. The particular intervention to be used is finalized and implemented. Fill circle. Follow-up and evaluation is done. If the intervention did not bring in the desired result, then we again go back to the first step of analyzing the problem in detail in terms of the antecedent factors and then deciding on the intervention strategies to be adopted. For instance, the problem is the aggressive behavior of the child in the playground. Examples of occurrence of the aggressive behavior by the child in the playground is cited. When did it occur? How did it start? What was the duration and intensity, etc.? The consequences: how did the teacher react to the aggressive behavior of the child? How did other classmates present reacted? And any other consequence, maybe punishment by the principal of the school, are also noted. Analysis of the antecedent and consequences of the problem then leads to the setting of goals. The goal may be to reduce the aggressive behavior of the child. To achieve this goal, the target response, i.e., the response which need to be changed, are specified. In this case, the target responses may be reduction in hitting behavior, using abusive language, overcoming getting angry very quick. Thereafter, the appropriate intervention technique to be used are decided and implemented. 1.2.5 Techniques of Behavior Modification. Behavior modification uses different techniques to modify a person's behavior. It's based on the use of a reward system that targets specific behaviors. Rewards are used to reshape a person's motivations so old habits are eliminated and new, more beneficial habits are formed. 3 techniques of behavior modification are I. Systematic desensitization, E. Aversive conditioning, and E. Token economy. Other techniques include IV. Extinction, and V. Biofeedback. The 3 techniques are given in detail in the following paragraphs. I. Systematic desensitization. Systematic desensitization is a behavior modification practice used to eliminate fears or undesirable emotions. It is based on the classical conditioning principles of pairing anxiety-provoking stimulus event with a relaxation response. Exposure to the fear-producing stimuli while focusing on relaxation techniques eventually leads to the fear-inducing stimuli, resulting in the relaxation response rather than fear. The assumption here is that relaxation and anxiety cannot go together. If we bring in relaxation, then anxiety has to go. Thus, systematic desensitization uses the principle of counter-conditioning, which counters the anxiety connected with a particular behavior or situation by inducing a relaxed response to it instead. This method is often used in the treatment of people who are afraid of flying. Another example of this practice will be removing the fear of public speaking. This is done by gradually exposing the person to the experience of public speaking. Speaking in front of the family or a small group of friends may be the first step. The person then gradually works up to speaking in front of a larger group of strangers or associates. Systematic desensitization involves the following steps. Step 1. Constructing an anxiety hierarchy. The first and most important requirement is to prepare a list of all the situation, events, objects that evoke fear or anxiety in the client. This has to be arranged in a hierarchical order from lowest anxiety-provoking stimulus to the highest anxiety-provoking stimulus. The degree to which each item produces anxiety is measured in terms of subjective unit of distress, SUD. There should usually be 5-1-0 SUD difference between each item in the hierarchy. An example of an anxiety hierarchy in case of a person who has fear of speaking in the public is as follows. Rahul is a newly recruited manager of the company and he has to attend a conference of the managers from the region and represent his company's policies and progresses. But Rahul is very anxious about this. Systematic desensitization can be used to help Rahul overcome his anxiety. First of all, the counselor can help Rahul construct an anxiety hierarchy. The list may be as follows: 2 weeks before the conference, reading the brochure for the conference of the managers 10 days before the conference, discussing with senior managers about things to be presented in the conference. 8 days before the conference, discussing with the colleagues about the conference. 6 days before the conference, preparing notes on the things to be presented. 4 days before the conference, rehearsing the things to be presented 1 day before the conference, keeping the materials ready that need to be taken to the conference. The night before the conference day, morning of the conference, getting ready for the conference, arriving at the conference venue, meeting other managers from other companies. Rahul's turn comes to present his company's case. Step 2. Training in relaxation. This consists of helping the client achieve a relaxed state of body and mind. Different kinds of relaxation techniques are available. Jacobson's progressive muscular relaxation is commonly used, though it requires training and takes longer time. Among other relaxation methods are Shvasana, meditation, pranayama, and so on. The main thing here is that the client should find it comfortable and achieve the desired state, i.e., relaxation. Jacobson's relaxation technique is based on the premise that muscular tension and relaxation are incompatible. It involves creating muscular tension in each part of the body and then relaxing it. This practice of alternatively tensing and relaxing the group of muscles one by one creates a very relaxed state, e.g., for relaxing hands, make a fist, create the tension, feel it, and then gradually relax them by releasing the hand. When we are in anxious state, our muscle groups get tensed. Hence, we need to know how to release that tension and make it relaxed. Step 3. Presenting anxiety-provoking items during relaxation state. The last step is presenting the hierarchy of anxiety-provoking items one by one when the client is in a relaxed state. It starts from the lowest anxiety-producing stimulus to the highest anxiety-producing stimulus. The client relaxes and then presented with the first item in the list, and the client relaxes again. Then the client is presented the next item in the list. The client visualizes each stimulus situation for at least 20 to 30 seconds. If the client experiences anxiety while visualizing any particular item, he can stop there and relax, and then visualize a new item in between, e.g., in the above instance, if Rahul experiences anxiety at the item 6 days before the conference, then a new item can be introduced there 7 days before the conference. This pairing of anxiety-provoking situation with relaxation helps one to be able to face the situation and gradually gain confidence in approaching the real-life situation later. Aversive conditioning. Aversion helps break bad habits through associating aversive stimuli to the undesirable habit. Eventually, the undesirable habit becomes associated with the negative consequence and the behavior is reduced. This technique employs the principles of classical conditioning to lessen the appeal of a behavior that is difficult to change because it is either very habitual or temporarily rewarding. The client is exposed to an unpleasant stimulus while engaged in or thinking about the behavior in question. Eventually, the behavior itself becomes associated with unpleasant rather than pleasant feelings. One treatment method used with alcoholics is the administration of a nausea-inducing drug together with an alcoholic beverage to produce an aversion to the taste and smell of alcohol by having it become associated with nausea. Token economy. Human behavior is routinely motivated and rewarded by positive reinforcement. Token economy is based on systematic positive reinforcement where rules are established that specify particular behaviors that are to be reinforced, and a reward system is set up. A token economy is a highly effective behavior modification technique, especially with children. In this technique, desired behaviors result in the reward of a token, such as a poker chip or a sticker, and undesirable behaviors result in the removal of a token. When children obtain a certain number of tokens, the children get a meaningful object or privilege in exchange for the tokens. Eventually, the rewarding of tokens decreases and desirable behaviors display independently. Extinction. Eradicating undesirable behavior by deliberately withholding reinforcement is another popular treatment method called extinction. For example, a child who habitually shouts to attract attention may be ignored unless he or she speaks in a conversational tone. This is based on the principle that if the behavior is not rewarded or encouraged, it will become extinct. Biofeedback behavior modification principles also can be used to treat emotional problems that are triggered by a physical symptom. Biofeedback is a method that provides immediate feedback on a person's physiological state, be it heart rate, breathing rate, or blood pressure. Feedback is provided by a mechanical device that lets the person know when a particular symptom is present. By controlling the symptom, the resulting emotional response can be prevented. An example of this would be someone who has problems controlling anger. The increases in breathing rate and heart rate can be monitored and controlled with practice. Once controlled, a person is better able to control an angry outburst. 1.2.6 Potentials and limitations of behavior modification.
The whole point of behavior modification techniques is to change undesirable or harmful behaviors and replace them with healthier, more desirable ones. There are many advantages of the behavioral approach to counseling. When applied properly, the technique can be effective in working with children, adults, and animals also. In fact, it can be used for changing the behavior of any living beings. Animal trainers frequently turn to behavior modification techniques to help pet owners turn bad habits into good habits. They also make use of behavior techniques to train animals the different types of new behavior as we see in animal and birds shows. Behavioral modification aims at enabling the clients to take charge of their behavior. Substance abuse counselors, for example, often encourage clients to take ownership of their behaviors and change them using behavior modification techniques. The subject client in the behavioral intervention takes an active role and ownership of the change process. The basic concepts and methods of behavior modification are pretty easy to understand and implement. Behavioral approach focuses on the current behavioral problems in the context of the individual's current environment situation. It does not analyze the past events, happenings situation. Behavioral intervention spells out achievable behavioral goals in terms that enable you to measure your success. The intervention techniques follow a systemic step-by-step procedure. A series of steps are delineated that to bring about change and lead to the desired behavior. There are a variety of therapeutic techniques and procedures associated with behavior modification, so the technique is best used by specially trained, skilled practitioners. 1.3 Introduction to Cognitive Approach. Cognitive approach in counseling emphasizes the role of cognition or thought in influencing our behavior. As opposed to behavioral changes based on reward or punishment system, the cognitive approach focuses on the role that thinking plays in how do we feel and behave. Transformation of how one thinks becomes critical in producing behavioral changes. Cognitive approach in counseling points out the dynamics of the human being in terms of his thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, and values. Hence, it is not simply a stimulus-response mechanism. The organism in between plays a vital role with all his thoughts and attitude in bringing about behavioral changes. The fundamental principle here is that thoughts, cognitions, cause our feelings and behaviors. Thus, cognitive therapy is based on the idea that our thoughts cause our feelings and behaviors, not external things like people, situations, and events. Hence, we can change the way we think to feel, act better even if the situation does not change. Thus, in cognitive therapies, the counselors focus on teaching the clients how to think differently. Therefore, the goal of therapy is to help clients unlearn their unwanted reactions and to learn a new way of reacting. Therapists in the cognitive field work with clients to solve present-day problems by helping them to identify distorted thinking that causes emotional discomfort. There's little emphasis on the historical root of a problem. Rather, the focus is on what's wrong with my present thinking that is causing me distress. Aaron Beck developed cognitive therapy in the 1960s. The treatment is based on the principle that maladaptive behavior, ineffective, self-defeating behavior, is triggered by inappropriate or irrational thinking patterns. Called automatic thoughts, instead of reacting to the reality of a situation, an individual automatically reacts to his or her own distorted view of the situation. Cognitive therapy strives to change these thought patterns, also known as cognitive distortions, by examining the rationality and validity of the assumptions behind them. This process is termed cognitive restructuring. Cognitive therapy is different from behavior therapy in that it focuses mostly on the thoughts and emotions that lead to certain behaviors. In other words, behavior therapy is more action-based and cognitive therapy is the mental or emotional beginnings that drive us to perform those actions. Usually in practice, both cognitive and behavioral principles are combined to deal with the problems. Hence, it is called cognitive behavioral approach, which counselors more frequently use in counseling. Most therapists seem to feel that the best form of psychotherapy is a combination of these two principles. This is what's known as cognitive behavior modification or cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is based on the idea that our feelings are governed by our thoughts about situations, people, and events in our lives and not those things themselves. Rather than focusing on changing the external forces we see as causing the problems, cognitive behavioral therapy focuses on changing the way we think to help us feel better. By learning to think differently, a person can develop rational, self-counseling skills that can be used to deal with life. Thus, cognitive behavior therapy is defined as therapy that is based on the belief that our thoughts are directly connected to how we feel. Cognitive behavioral therapy attempts to change clients' unhealthy behavior through cognitive restructuring, examining assumptions behind the thought patterns, and through the use of behavior therapy techniques. For instance, in the treatment of eating disorders, therapists can help clients to change attitudes and thoughts about ideal body shape and weight, but also at the same time should focus on changing the client's behavior of eating unhealthy diet and replace it with normalized eating patterns. Thus, both cognitive as well as behavior therapy are involved. 1.3.1 Steps Procedure of Cognitive Therapy. The focus in cognitive behavior intervention is the thinking pattern. Hence, the first important step is to identify the faulty irrational thought patterns. Using the Socratic method is one way to do this. By questioning our thoughts about a situation that creates anxiety and stress in us, we can pinpoint the irrational assumptions through which we view situations. If a person is upset because a friend isn't returning a phone call, he may assume that the friend is angry with him, whereas it may be that his friend might have been busy in some important work. Similarly, when the officer calls his junior repeatedly and the latter does not pick up the phone, the officer thinks that the junior knowingly avoids to do work. However, it may be that the junior could not answer the call because of some problem in the phone. Once a person understands their irrational thought patterns, they can use this information to modify their behavior as they deal with the situations and events of their life that might be causing them problems. In many instances, we jump to immediate conclusion and our behavior becomes governed by this. However, this may lead to problem behavior. Immediate emotional reactions to situations are created in an area of the brain known as the limbic system. This area of the brain moves fast and reacts to situations based on instantly made impressions. This is helpful when a speeding car is coming at us and we need to freak out and run, but more complex situations need a reaction based more on knowledge, facts, and experience. In these situations, speed is not a virtue. The part of the brain used to process these facts is the prefrontal cortex. Unfortunately, this area of the brain takes longer to react, giving people the opportunity to act impulsively in situations using irrational assumptions. If a person can learn to modify the impulsive behavior and wait for the prefrontal cortex to kick in other words, think things through, they can modify the effect the situation has on their emotional state and sometimes the situation itself in a more positive manner. Thus, irrational ideas, thoughts, need to be identified and questioned in order for the positive change in behavior to occur. Corey, 2009, proposes the following 3 stages in cognitive behavior therapy. Phase 1, self-observation. This phase involves listening closely to your internal dialogue or self-talk and observing your own behaviors. You want to be especially aware of any negative self-statements that are actually contributing to your anxiety and panic symptoms. Phase 2, begin new self-talk. Once you recognize your negative self-talk, you can begin to change it. As you catch yourself in familiar negative thought patterns, you recreate a new and positive internal dialogue. I can't becomes it may be difficult, but I can. These new self-statements now guide new behaviors. Rather than using avoidant behaviors to cope with panic and anxiety, you become willing to experience the anxiety-provoking situations. This leads to better coping skills, and as your small successes build upon one another, you make great gains in your recovery. Phase 3, learning new skills. Each time you are able to identify and restructure your negative thoughts and change your response to panic and anxiety, you are learning new skills. Because you are now acutely aware of your thoughts, you are better able to gauge your anxiety and react in a more useful manner. When your negative thoughts control you, it becomes difficult to control your behavioral responses to unpleasant situations. But CBM can give you back some lost control. As your thoughts change from negative to positive, you start to behave differently in many situations. And you will likely find that others react differently to the new positive you as well.
1.3.2 Techniques of Cognitive Therapy. The prominent cognitive therapies are Cognitive Behavior Therapy by Aaron Beck, 1976, and Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy by Albert Ellis, 1960. Eric Burns, 1964. Transactional analysis is also another cognitive intervention used by the therapists. 1.3.3 Cognitive Behavior Therapy. The therapy assumes that an individual's emotions and behavior are the outcome of the way in which he thinks about the world. According to Beck, people experience emotional problems when they engage excessively in fallacious or dysfunctional thinking. These are irrational or faulty thought patterns. Here are the 10 most common irrational thought patterns or cognitive distortions. Beck, 1976, Burns, 1992. All or none thinking. This is thinking in terms of either good or bad, e.g., your friend always needs to be good to you. This type of distortion is the culprit when people think in extremes, with no gray areas or middle ground. All or none thinkers often use words like always and never when describing things. I always get stuck in traffic. My bosses never listen to me. This type of thinking can magnify the stressor in your life, making them seem like bigger problems than they may, in reality, be. Overgeneralization. It refers to our drawing a conclusion based only on a single incident, e.g., when you asked for some help to your neighbor and did not get it, you conclude that your neighbor is not good. Those prone to overgeneralization tend to take isolated events and assume that all future events will be the same. For example, an overgeneralizer who faces a rude sales clerk may start believing that all sales clerks are rude and that shopping will always be a stressful experience. Mental filter. Those who use mental filtering as their distortion of choice tend to gloss over positive events and hold a magnifying glass to the negative. 10 things can go right, but a person operating under the influence of a mental filter may only notice the one thing that goes wrong. Add a little overgeneralization and all or nothing thinking to the equation, and you have a recipe for stress. Disqualifying the positive. Similar to mental filtering, those who disqualify the positive tend to treat positive events like flukes, thereby clinging to a more negative worldview and set of low expectations for the future. Have you ever tried to help a friend solve a problem, only to have every solution you pose shot down with a "yeah but" response? You've witnessed this cognitive distortion firsthand. Jumping to conclusions. People do this one all the time. Rather than letting the evidence bring them to a logical conclusion, they set their sights on a conclusion, often negative, and then look for evidence to back it up, ignoring evidence to the contrary. The kid who decides that everyone in his new class will hate him, and knows that they're only acting nice to him in order to avoid punishment, is jumping to conclusions. Conclusion jumpers can often fall prey to mind reading, where they believe that they know the true intentions of others without talking to them, and fortune telling, predicting how things will turn out in the future and believing these predictions to be true. Magnification and minimization. Similar to mental filtering and disqualifying the positive, this cognitive distortion involves placing a stronger emphasis on negative events and downplaying the positive ones. The customer service representative who only notices the complaints of customers and fails to notice positive interactions is a victim of magnification and minimization. Another form of this distortion is known as catastrophizing, where one imagines and then expects the worst possible scenario. It can lead to a lot of stress. Emotional reasoning. This one is a close relative of jumping to conclusions in that it involves ignoring certain facts when drawing conclusions. Emotional reasoners will consider their emotions about a situation as evidence rather than objectively looking at the facts. I am feeling completely overwhelmed, therefore my problems must be completely beyond my ability to solve them, or I'm angry with you, therefore you must be in the wrong here, are both examples of faulty emotional reasoning. Acting on these beliefs as fact can, understandably, contribute to even more problems to solve. Should, must statements. I must get grade A, I should obey my parents all the time, I must have this top brand toy set, I should be loved by all. These are the statements which are irrational and illogical and lead to problems. Those who rely on should statements tend to have rigid rules, set by themselves or others, that always need to be followed, at least in their minds.
They don't see flexibility in different circumstances, and they put themselves under considerable stress trying to live up to these self-imposed expectations. If your internal dialogue involves a large number of shoulds, you may be under the influence of this cognitive distortion. Labeling and mislabeling. Those who label or mislabel will habitually place labels that are often inaccurate or negative on themselves and others. He's a whiner. She's lazy. I'm just a useless worrier. These labels tend to define people and contribute to a one-dimensional view of them, paving the way for overgeneralizations to move in. Labeling cages people into roles that don't always apply and prevents us from seeing people, ourselves included, as we really are. Personalization. When you attribute everything to yourself, that you are the cause of it, it causes anxiety and distress. Those who personalize their stressors tend to blame themselves or others for things over which they have no control, creating stress where it need not be. Those prone to personalization tend to blame themselves for the actions of others or blame others for their own feelings. Cognitive behavior therapy aims at identifying our faulty irrational thought patterns and making them conscious. The patient is then able to recognize when he is about to perform an undesirable behavior, such as compulsive hand washing, or when he is engaging in negative thoughts that are not supported by logic or reality. The process then calls for the patient to halt the behavior or thought, then consciously replace it with a desired thought or behavior. 1.3.4 Techniques used by CBT specialists. Therapists use several different techniques in the course of cognitive behavioral therapy to help patients examine the dysfunctional thoughts and change to rational thoughts and behaviors. These include reality testing. The client is asked to put his thought to test in the real situation, thus the client tests it experimentally. 2. Validity testing. The therapist asks the patient to defend his or her thoughts. and beliefs. If the patient cannot produce objective evidence supporting his or her assumptions, the invalidity or faulty nature is exposed. 3. Guided discovery. The therapist asks the patient a series of questions designed to guide the patient towards the discovery of his or her cognitive distortions. 4. Writing in a journal. Patients keep a detailed written diary of situations that arise in everyday life, the thoughts and emotions surrounding them, and the behaviors that accompany them. The therapist and patient then review the journal together to discover maladaptive thought patterns and how these thoughts impact behavior. Homework. In order to encourage self-discovery and reinforce insights made. In therapy, the therapist may ask the patient to do homework assignments. These may include note-taking during the session, journaling, review of an audio tape of the patient session, or reading books or articles appropriate to the therapy. They may also be more behaviorally focused, applying a newly learned strategy or coping mechanism to a situation, and then recording the results for the next therapy session. For instance, Sheila felt bad and depressed when her friends did not take her to the market visit. Here the therapist can help Sheila identify the basic assumption she has here, which is obviously an irrational thought pattern. Why should Sheila feel that she is bad if her friends did not take her? Does she have all the bad qualities? What are they? Sheila is then helped to analyze the distortions in her thinking that she is the cause, i.e., she is bad, so her friends did not take her. 1.4 Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. Albert Ellis is the founder of the Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy. He talks about the irrational beliefs which are responsible for our behavioral and emotional problems disturbances. According to Ellis, 1962, the 11 common irrational beliefs are: it is essential to be loved and approved by every significant person in one's life to be worthwhile. A person must be competent, adequate, and achieving in everything attempted. Some people are wicked, bad, and villainous and should be blamed or punished. It is terrible and disastrous whenever events do not occur as one hopes. Unhappiness is the result of outside events and a person has no control over such despair. Something potentially dangerous or harmful should be a cause of great concern and should always be kept in mind. Running away from difficulties or responsibilities is easier than facing them. A person must depend on others and must have someone stronger on whom to rely. The past determines one's present behavior and thus it cannot be changed. A person should get upset over the problems and difficulties of others. There is always a right answer to every problem and a failure to find this answer is a disaster. These beliefs are called irrational because these are rigid, not based on the fact. The REBT helped the clients to identify the irrational beliefs and think more rationally. This is done by the ABCD model proposed by Ellis, where A refers to activating events, i.e., events, situations causing the distorted thinking. B refers to beliefs, the evaluative beliefs, rational or irrational, which we have about the activating event. C refers to the consequences, the emotional, behavioral and cognitive consequences of the beliefs. D refers to disputing the beliefs on which our irrational thoughts are based. 1.4.1 The sequence in the REBT model. First, the activating events are identified. Then the consequences of this event are identified. Events lead to consequences. However, events as such do not lead to consequences. The consequences or our responses are based on our belief system about the events situations. When these beliefs are irrational, it results in problems, hence, we need to dispute these. Let us see one example. One evening, Hari was not doing his study and was watching TV. His mother scolded him, saying he always sees TV and does not do his studies properly. Hari felt very sad for his mother's scolding. Here the activating event, A, is mother's scolding, consequence, C, is Hari's sadness. This sadness resulted because of Hari's belief, B, system, that my mother always scolds me or nobody loves me. This irrational belief then needs to be disputed, D. Disputation is the most important step in the REBT therapy. Cognitive behavioral approach is widely used for dealing with a range of disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorders, phobias, panic disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder are all conditions that are effectively treated by cognitive behavior modification. Cognitive behavioral therapy attempts to change clients' unhealthy behavior through cognitive restructuring, examining assumptions behind the thought patterns, and through the use of behavior therapy techniques. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a treatment option for a number of mental disorders, including depression, dissociative identity disorder, eating disorders, generalized anxiety disorder, hypochondriasis, insomnia and obsessive-compulsive disorder. 1.4.2 Potentials and limitations of cognitive behavioral approach. Cognitive behavioral approach aims at correcting problematic underlying assumptions, thus leading to long-term results. Thus, the cause of the problem is corrected. The structured nature of therapy sessions ensures bringing about fruitful result outcome. It very much reduces the possibility that sessions will become chat sessions in which not much is accomplished therapeutically. The course of treatment is shorter than that of conventional talk therapy. This makes the cognitive behavior modification as a less expensive means of obtaining mental health treatment. The self-help element of cognitive behavior therapy enables the clients to on their own to maintain their own treatment even after formal therapy has ended. Cognitive behavior modification can be performed individually or in group therapy sessions. These therapies are best known for treating mild depression, anxiety, and anger problems. Cognitive behavioral therapy may not be appropriate for all patients. Patients with significant cognitive impairments, patients with traumatic brain injury or organic brain disease, for example, and individuals who are not willing to take an active role in the treatment process are not usually good candidates. It may not be appropriate for small children also who will not have the language capability to think through their assumptions and thought patterns. 1.5 Summary. This unit gives some insight into the behavioral and cognitive approach to counseling. The behavioral approach is based on the two learning theories of classical conditioning by Pavlov and operant conditioning by Skinner. The principles and procedure of behavioral approach are described in detail. We also learned about the different behavioral techniques. One of the important techniques under behavioral counseling is systematic desensitization, which aims at shaping the behavior of the person in a systematic manner. We also came to know about the cognitive behavioral techniques such as cognitive behavior therapy and rational emotive behavior therapy, which are widely used for dealing with various problem behaviors. The combination of cognitive therapies with behavior modification has been found to be more effective than either of these approaches alone. They have been found to be successful in managing many maladaptive behaviors such as phobia, depression, anxiety, etc. Finally, the merits and limitations of the behavioral and cognitive approach to counseling were also discussed. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.